We've seen this lately, especially with Obama. It's actually called a recess appointment, but it's only valid until the end of the next session of the Senate. So in other words, it gives the president the flexibility of appointing someone if there's a vacancy within a department. But it's not a permanent vacancy, or it's not a permanent appointment unless Congress actually brings the person before them and questions the person, trying to find out whether the person is qualified for the position. This was a bit controversial. Once a president appoints different executive officers, there's debate as far as how that executive officer could actually be removed. Kind of after the dust settled, it was decided impeachment by the House, followed by conviction of the Senate. Remember, the House impeaches, and then the Senate is actually like the trial, if you will. What was controversial is the president wanted to have the capability of dismissing an executive officer. In other words, he appointed that officer. He wanted to also have the ability to dismiss that person. And now that's pretty standard stuff. Commander-in-Chief, military powers. He's Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. We talked about this a little bit last week. He's also Commander-in-Chief of the militias, if those militias are called into the service of the United States. But again, it's kind of a shared power. Congress declares war, establishes the rules for military, in other words, the training, all the particulars, where they're going to be housed, billeted. And also, Congress controls the purse strings. If a war is started, any kind of funds that Congress allocates to that military operation has a 2-year period. And after that 2-year period, Congress then has to vote again and reestablish the funding. We talked about this when we were talking about Article 1. We were talking about the legislative branch. The King of England, for example, has ultimate say. He can start wars, he can fund wars. His advisors don't, and the different houses within the British Parliament cannot control what the king does from a military standpoint. Our founders wanted some separation. They wanted to ensure that the president was going to become a Gaddafi, a strongman. So they wanted to make sure that even though the president was the commander-in-chief, the Congress would then hold the purse strings and have some control of the military. Once again, commander-in-chief has broad incidental military powers. You could not include every particular scenario within the Constitution for the president to be able to follow up from a military standpoint. So in other words, if a war is going on, the commander-in-chief has to have the ability to change, to make rules, to change the aspects of the war, including, and this is something President Lincoln did, including the suspension of habeas corpus. And habeas corpus, of course, is the right of any individual to be brought before a judge. So in the case of military conflict, a person would be brought before either a commanding officer or maybe a military tribunal and would not have the ability to come before a judge. Foreign affairs are probably one of the larger aspects of presidential or executive powers. Congress and the Senate both have their fingers in it, but really the president has the most power when it comes to military or foreign affairs. Once again, Congress declares and finances the wars. The Senate approves treaties and diplomatic appointments when you're talking about relations with other countries. But the president has the power of meeting with foreign authorities, appointing ambassadors and diplomats, and entering into treaties. When you're talking about treaties, this was kind of fascinating to me. A compact is typically an agreement between two governments. It doesn't necessarily carry the same weight as a treaty. A treaty is a compact. It's between two sovereigns, but it's being executed for a longer period of time. Could be 10 years, 20 years, hundreds of years. It also becomes the supreme law of the land. So in other words, once a treaty has been signed, it's almost like an amendment to the Constitution. It is now part of our legal system. Because it is such an important, weighty procedure to enter into, the Senate has to be able to vote on any particular treaties by 2/3 approval. So in other words, they're not going to allow the president to just enter into a treaty without them okaying the treaty. And you're probably familiar with, just recently, we entered into a new agreement, a strategic arms agreement with Russia. Even though the Russians signed it, even though our president signed it, it doesn't become law or binding until Senate approves it as well. One aspect of treaties I found kind of fascinating was there were fears that a treaty could actually provide unenumerated powers. Just based upon the treaty, it could actually empower Congress, it could empower the president with powers that are not defined within the Constitution. Limitations of the executive branch. He could appoint, for example, ambassadors, very high-ranking individuals who represent the United States, but he couldn't appoint senators. He was the commander-in-chief of the militias, but that was only when those militias were active under the service of the United States, had been called into service. Generic restrictions on federal power, thank goodness for this, that the president couldn't, for example, go out and disarm the American people or the state militias. There's restrictions to the limits of his authority in the executive branch. All right. We're going to move on to the judicial. And as Roger mentioned a moment ago, we'll take on some questions at the end. Tonight is, as you probably are well aware, we didn't have quite as much reading tonight, so we really don't have as many slides, so we'll get through this pretty quickly. Get out of here on time this evening. The judicial branch. It followed what had already been established under the Articles of Confederation. There were already court systems established. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, with the executive branch, in some regards, you're starting from scratch. You have to decide how you're going to structure your government. So they had to look at what had already been established. They had to look at what had been established during the colonial period, during British court systems, or the royal court systems in other countries. Some of the things that get back to the executive is that the president, one of his duties is appointing federal judges. So, for example, our Supreme Court judges and other